Have you ever worked in an office that felt like a dysfunctional family? Or have you ever wondered what you and your colleagues could accomplish if all of those smart and talented people could just learn to communicate and get along with one another? There's a discipline within the broad field of consulting called organization development, or OD, and it's been around since the post-war era with roots that go back even further. OD consultants look at an organization from many different angles, interpersonal, intercultural, and even some unconscious levels, in order not to tell the clients what to do, but just to help them get out of their own way so they can accomplish their work more effectively. My guest, George Kessler, is a student at American University's master's program in OD, and she's preparing to graduate in just a few weeks. She's here to discuss her program, and in particular, a trip to South Africa, where she and her fellow students got to practice their OD chops on an actual client. Here now is Melissa George Kessler. What was your purpose there? Like, what was your purpose for you as a student, and what was your purpose for who you were working with?
Yeah, so we were there. I was there for 3 weeks. The first week was basically like diversity and cultural skills. So that was, I think, the name of the course. But basically, it was getting to know the culture and making those cultural dimensions come alive by actually seeing another culture, being in another culture. The second week was a compressed consulting cycle with a client in a team.
Okay, wait a minute.
Yep.
What's a compressed consulting cycle?
So in OD, we commonly use a consulting frame called action research. So it's entry, contracting, data collection, analysis, feedback, intervention, back to entry and contracting if need be, or more data collection.
And so not everyone's going to know what those things mean.
Yeah.
Maybe as you talk about what you did, you can sort of highlight, flag what this was the entry, this is what I did. And
yes. So basically what that means is that you go into a system, you collect some data, you look at what it says, and then you do something. Mm-hmm. An intervention can be asking a question. An intervention can be a full day workshop with 1,000 people. There's the whole range. And then you use whatever comes out of that intervention to go and do it again. Just to rephrase the question in partnership with the client, and then get more data, analyze it, do another intervention. And theoretically, this can go on forever and ever. As long as you're improving things, it probably should. So in South Africa, we basically had 4 days with our client. Whoa. And so obviously we were not getting to the workshop with 1,000 people. Mm-hmm. And the compressed cycle that we did was basically going in, meeting our client, and the clients were set up by our professors. That would be quite ambitious to find a client in 4 days. We went in, met with a client, tried to understand the situation they were facing, and then did data collection and feedback. Uh-huh. And that was the goal. And actually, I would say all 3 of the teams that our class had did some intervention. Oh, wow. Whether how formal it is and where you draw that line is, a matter of taste in some ways. But so that was the second week of what we did, is we spent those 4 days, and those were some long days, let me tell you.
What do you mean, like a long how?
Long length wise, I mean, those were some 16, 17-hour days.
Wow.
But they were fun, and we learned an enormous amount about being in a team and working with a client, and how being in a team interacts with working with a client. And we also learned a lot about our particular client. And in the client situation that my team had, there were a lot of personality and cultural factors going on a more on a smaller scale within the organization we were working with. So that was the second week. And then the third week, I went on vacation in Cape Town, which was lovely, until I fell and sprained my ankle.
Right. Now, the team that you were on and the group that you were working with, like, how many people were in the client group?
So that is a good question. We had a client, and then we were actually working with 2 organizations that were considering a merger.
Oh, wow.
So we had a client in one organization, and then we did interviews and data collection with individuals in the other organization.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
And
So-
did you ever get the two organizations together in the same room?
We did not, actually. They
Uh-huh.
got each other together. Is kind of the end of the story. It ended up well that they were, talking to each other and making plans for the future. So,
Wow. And you think, do you, are there a lot of the problems that I've observed in organizations that I feel are problems are people often don't feel that they have time for anything that has to do with process. Like, it's like, no, we've just got to do it. Let's just do it. And then after it's already been done, they spend much more time undoing what they've done, and a merger is like one of those classic cases where stuff that you didn't think of ahead of time is going to come up if you don't address it. Are there any did you find that, do you feel like you helped them prevent things that might have happened if they had not taken the time to do an OD intervention?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, people often think of OD as process consulting, and that's not the worst way to think about it. But again, it's like, I'm talking about the action research cycle, and nobody listening to this is going to know what that means. No one is probably going to know what process consulting is either.
But they can. It's consulting about how you do things.
Yes, exactly. So if you think about, you went to the grocery store at noon or whatever and decided to pick up groceries for the week, and if you think, okay, you got milk and cheese and butter and whatever, and then if you think about how you did that, so did you make a list? Did you plan it so you could only go once a week? Did you pay with credit card or check or whatever? Like, how can you improve that process? In a way, that's what we're doing. So in the situation we saw in South Africa with our client, the merger, as it were, had pretty much already been processed through in a lot of ways. I mean, they had legal and financial go-ahead, but there's another aspect to merging two organizations, and that's that the organizations themselves, and what are their cultures, and what are the personalities of the leaders, and how are the people going to react and interface together, and how is it going to work? And I think that is often overlooked. I came back with a definite desire to figure that out, like how much OD happens in mergers and acquisitions, and that's something I'll definitely be researching, because it was thrilling for me. But yeah, I think you're right. People rush into things and they do things and they don't think about the process, and that's what the OD folks of the world are trying to help people with.
So, just speaking in general terms, because I know you have confidentiality that you have to observe, but did you get the feeling that, like, one of the parties learned something that, wow, we didn't know that now we're going to be able to do something different that we might have otherwise screwed up, or, you know what I mean? Did you get any what was some of the feedback you got from the client that they said was helpful to them?
Yeah, the primary client found it very helpful to see more about that human side of what intentions and motivations were present in both parties, honestly.
And can you say more about that? Like, what intentions and motivations? Like,
yeah, like why do people want to do this merger? What's bringing people to the table?
Do you think people had darker assumptions than were actually present?
I think people just didn't have a good understanding. I mean, I think you could say, good intentions, bad intentions, but at the end of the day, there's just a lack of understanding. And so I think that was a big part of it. An understanding, like, how are these systems different? Not how are their books different? How are their legal structures different? How are their physical plants different? Like, how are the people different? How do they interact differently?
So they're mostly different people with different occupation and different...
No, they have the same occupation, but different personalities. And, like, over time, these two organizations, which are quite similar in many ways, they're in the same field, they have grown up, and they have different cultures, and different people are attracted to them.
You're talking about organizational cultures.
Yes, organizational cultures. And the people within them have different takes on what's bringing them to the table. Their clients are different. Their missions, while very similar, do have kind of different flavors. So how do you merge those things? And what do you need to understand? Or I guess to back up, I mean, first you got to understand there are differences, and understand those with good texture. So it's not just like, oh yeah, we like to do this while they like to do that. How do you bring those together in a way that's really functional and in a process that really helps everyone feel included and everyone feel like this is going to create something that's greater than the sum of the parts.
And I know there's different techniques that you can use. What did you use, like a survey, or did you sit down with people and do interviews one-on-one? What were some of the ways that you gathered the information?
Yeah, we gathered data primarily because of the short time frame that we were working with through interviews. And we were going into this using a philosophy called appreciative inquiry. Appreciative inquiry. Which is something I think definitely worth Googling. But the idea of appreciative inquiry is to look at strengths and to look at dreams that are within a system versus looking at deficits and looking at problems. So we kind of tempered our approach with what we would call an appreciative stance. So we asked people what the strengths of their systems were and what their strengths were and what would they like to see come out of this merger. What's the best possible outcome? Did
you guys come up with that on your own, like as a team?
Well, appreciative inquiry is a philosophy, I guess. It's an OD tenet that's out there. We certainly didn't come up with that, but we came up with the questions. Yeah. So, and the idea is to seek that good information, to say, what is there that's here that we can build with? And, one of the ideas behind appreciative inquiry is the concept of social constructionism, right? So that reality is kind of what you make it. And looking at something with an AI lens or an appreciative stance, coming at it with an appreciative stance, you are looking at what good is there already versus what is dysfunctional or problematic. And in doing that, you make people think about the things that are good.
Do you think that any of the clients came away from it feeling like they maybe didn't realize some of the strengths that they had and they identified some that they didn't know they had?
I think so. I think more so they probably tapped into their desires for the future and for a positive future together and really thought about and articulated what is it that we could be. And in doing that, I mean, that does kind of plant a seed. If you think about it, even in your own life, like thinking about the best possible outcome is a much more uplifting experience than thinking about the worst possible outcome. And that is part of when I say the line between data collection and intervention can be a question. When you come in and you ask somebody, what are the strengths of your organization versus what's wrong around here? Like that's an intervention. You are directing thought in a specific way.
But what about the worst case scenario? Because they do have to think about that too, don't they?
Well, certainly, yeah. I mean, I think thinking about the worst case scenario is, it is certainly a thing you can do. It is probably not the only thing you should do.
But
if I can use the should word.
So. But did you have a method for kind of, like say the clients had some concerns? I'm sure they have concerns about the merger. Like, how did you address their fears?
Oh, yeah. We did ask about concerns. I mean, it wasn't just like, oh, happy. I mean, rainbows and flowers and all of that. And then that really, when we say appreciative stance, I mean, the concept of appreciative inquiry, we're influencing how we entered the system. But certainly, recognizing that people do have concerns, they have questions. And that's really, honestly, what we found is that when you started asking, like, okay, what are you concerned about? One way to frame that is, what questions do you have?
So let's say I am a member of the client system, and I've been told I'm going to meet with these people from from a foreign country, and what happens? I go into a room. What does the room look like? Like, where did this happen?
So we mostly talk to people in their offices.
So would it be individually, like I'd be sitting in a cubicle or a...
Yeah, we've talked to people in individual offices, and so mostly their space. Sometimes it wasn't their office.
So it was sort of private.
Yeah, it was pretty private.
And you would like take notes or?
Definitely.
Okay, and were they mostly managers?
Yes.
All managers?
Yeah. So we talked to effectively Yeah, it would be mostly managers and then a few staff.
And was it one-on-one or was it like one-on-two or?
Most of the interviews actually were 3-on-1,
Oh, okay.
which could be a little overwhelming. And then the last day, I actually stayed back at where we were staying. I call it the compound, back at the compound, and started doing data analysis. And my 2 teammates went out and did some final interviews.
So let's say, what would be like an opening question that you might ask me if I were a manager that was participating in this?
Well, we started with, what do you know about this potential merger?
That's good. Was there a lot of variety in the answers that you got?
Yeah, there was. I think variety between the managers and the staff. I mean, the managers obviously knew more than the staff did.
But wait, how do you know, but you didn't interview staff, or did you? Did I miss something?
We did some.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And was there so there was some difference in what the staff knew and what the now was there stuff that the staff knew that the management didn't know?
Well, I think when we got into talking about what are the strengths of the system and what do you see as the potential opportunities for this merger, then you definitely, I don't know if it's things that the managers didn't know, but it was a different perspective.
Okay, so you'd ask, what do they know? And then I would say, well, I've heard that, blah, blah, blah. And were you allowed to give any information or just ask?
We did not give information.
So any other good questions that seem to yield a lot of good information that you developed over time?
You're trying my memory. We I guess we had a strategy because there were 3 of us mostly interviewing one person. We had a strategy for who was asking questions when, but I always made sure to ask, do you support this merger or not?
Oh.
Like, straight up. You know, if you want to know the answer to a question, ask it.
Exactly.
And there's the question. And, happily in our case, we got yeses across the board. So in varying degrees. Yeah.
I'm surprised.
Yeah. So
do you think those were honest answers?
I do. I really do. I think the elaboration of those answers really gave me confidence that they were honest. I think, honestly, most people really were ready to go with it. And also, I don't think anyone had a disincentive to lie. I mean, I guess they didn't have an incentive to lie. You can edit that, too.
Did you, just something that just came up while we were just talking about that was, what were some ways that people negotiated authority and subordinate versus, like in OD, they talk about tops, middles, bottoms. Are there any things that surprised you about the way they handled authority there?
Well, keep in mind, we were only in the system for 4 days, so what we did was extremely limited. But I think, and most of the people we talked to were managers, basically. They were the people kind of calling the shots in these 2 systems. And I think how they interacted was very interesting.
With each other?
Yes.
So say more about that.
And that was really, I mean, to tell the tale, that was really it, was how the leaders of the 2 organizations interacted personally, interacted at a professional level, and how their interactions affected the interactions of the system. And ultimately could kind of make or break the merger, really. And that's one of the things we discovered and one of the insights we had, having collected all of this data, and something we were able to describe to our client and that she really understood. Oh,
so you kind of reflected back, you said this is what we observed happening interpersonally or intercommunicationally between the managers, and she acknowledged it, or did she learn anything she didn't know before?
Yes, I think she did. And an interesting kind of art imitates life situation that happened is
I was
that
wondering about that.
We, in our own consulting team, so there were 3 of us, we actually had an experience of basically personality difference that wasn't managed particularly well, and that, of course, came to a head, and, we had to resolve. And that sort of was what was going on in the system, really.
Oh, wow.
And, you're looking at fundamentally different personalities who are interacting but haven't sat down and said, okay, this is how we're going to manage these differences. So we actually told our client that story.
About your sort of use.
Yeah, about ourselves. it's kind of not exactly airing our own dirty laundry, but like certainly revealing parts of our process. And as an example, and not the only example, but that's, OD is pretty deep work actually. And part of that is because you're always working at multiple levels. So we're working with two organizations, both of whom have complicated interactions with their environment, that have complicated interactions within themselves, partly mediated by personality differences at the leadership level. And we are working with them as a team with our own dynamics. And then each of us is having to manage our own personality traits and, cultural needs and, personal needs. And, it really makes for a very interesting stew of things going on. And one of the reasons that I'm really enjoying my education is because we're getting a lot of theories and a lot of concepts, a lot of lenses through which to understand all of that, make sense of it, and then make better choices about it.
So I'm curious about like the interaction between the first, how many weeks were you there?
I was there 3 weeks total.
So the last week was sort of more fun. The first week was like orientation. What if you had just gone right into the client system without the orientation? How can you speculate about how that might have gone differently?
Yeah, in our particular client system, I don't know that it would have gone badly necessarily, but I think in general, it's a good idea to have a sense of what environment you're in. So in that sense, the orientation was very helpful. And, obviously it serviced a lot of other learning goals.
Did you find that the work environment felt comfortable to you being, from the United States? Did it feel similar or of would what happened in your client system, if it had would the same thing have happened in Washington, D.C.? Could it have happened? No.
The same thing would not have happened in Washington, D.C. It could have, but it would have been a very different flavor.
So can you say more about that, what you mean by that?
Yeah, I mean, I've talked about the personality differences between the leaders and how that translated into the cultures of the organizations. But, that organization environment interaction, that would really be what would be different here.
The organization environment interaction. Yeah. I don't really know what that means.
So both of the organizations that we were working with were kind of emerged in the post-apartheid era to serve a deeply underserved population. Okay. And so that permeated their culture and really had a lot of influence on the motivations of all of the leaders. Across the board, these people are passionate about serving their clients and really have a deep understanding and a deep love, I think, for their clients. So that would have been the difference of being here in D.C.
Well, you don't think that happens in D.C.?
I think it can happen in D.C., no doubt.
Maybe not on Capitol Hill.
I think it's very... one of the most striking things about being in South Africa for me is that, we met a lot of people, mostly kind of coming and going, but, apartheid ended in the 90s. I was born in the 80s, and so pretty much anyone, even slightly older than me, lived through it. I mean, literally lived through a huge dramatic change in everything. And has had to come to terms with how it was before and, adapt to how it is now, and being with people who either hated them or that were previously so hated. So I think that closeness really impacts a lot of how people are, and a lot of how systems and organizations are. And our own racial troubles are still very much with us. But it's, the Civil War was in the 1800s and the Civil Rights Movement was in the 60s. And it's like, in some ways, you can sweep that under the rug because time has passed. It doesn't really work that way, but a lot of people try to make it work that way.
Well, I don't know that much about the truth and reconciliation exercises that they've done. You know what I'm talking about? Do you know a lot about that, or did you learn about that as part of your orientation?
Yeah, we learned some of it. I think, you know, it is a part of life. And, you know, it's hard to know because the people we were interacting with obviously were selected for us. I mean, we didn't just, for the most part, find people. And the people we interacted with were politically active, I guess is a good way of saying it. I mean, they all had some connection to the anti-apartheid movement or, you know, that time period. And we were obviously there to study cultural difference and cultural competence and that type of thing. So it's hard to know, you know, just a cross-section of society, how things are. But I feel like from what we saw, it was very much a part of life. And I don't know, there's a book that I have and read part of, and, you know, of course I discarded it. It was called The Great Sort or The Big Sort or something like that. But it's basically like about like we have all sorted ourselves in the U.S. It's a book about the U.S. into little enclaves, you know, where it's like, you know, the rich white people live over there, and the poor white people live over there, and farmers live over there, and the poor black people live over there, and the richer white black people live over here, and like, you know, and it's like this type of immigrant that lives here, and you know, we've done it like racially and economically and politically, and I mean, any way you can think of, we've sliced and diced ourselves, and that is also very clearly true in South Africa. Probably, if somebody said to me, "What is the most striking thing about this country?" Barbed wire. I mean, unbelievable amounts of barbed wire.
Where? Around what?
And you know, it got to the point where, because we rode around in cars a lot and obviously didn't drive, and didn't do a lot of walking, really. It was mostly cars. Because, you know, there are security concerns, but just barbed wire everywhere. And it's almost like art after a while.
Wow.
You start seeing the different variations of it, and you know, I started thinking about like, how did people select which barbed wire they were gonna get?
I mean, where would it be? Like around people's property,
homes, businesses, like every institution pretty much was surrounded by barbed wire
to keep out
people
who might
do bad things, I guess.
So one thing that I'm really sensitive about when I travel, sensitive to, is I really don't respond well when I go into certain stores and there's just a level of like either impatience or rudeness. Like I know I really notice it when it's not there. Like, for example, one of the places I really enjoyed being in as a emotional vibe was Salt Lake City. I just noticed people were really nice in the Starbucks, whereas there's other places where it seems, actually there's a few places that seem ruder than here in DC. I in my experience, I've almost never been anywhere but how did that compare just on a, like going into a store? How did you feel? Like, was it friendly? Was it impatient? Was it, you know, what was the vibe like?
Most of the time, it was much slower than here more friendly. I would say, I mean, if you just want to say friendly and not friendly. I mean, again, it's not everywhere, certainly, and it is a generalization, but people are less, you know, directive, I guess. So we went into a liquor store once, and the guy was like willing to talk about every bottle of this or bottle of that. And finally, I told the person I was with, like, just pick one based on the picture. Like, come on, let's go. So I you know, there's me and my culture and my personality more than that.
Yeah.
And you know, of course, we did some shopping at like, you know, stands or, you know, at markets in Cape Town and a little bit in Johannesburg, and in one situation I was kind of time limited. I knew I was time limited and I wanted to get a certain number of things, and I kind of picked up and, you know, did my negotiation, and I mean, it was all maybe a 3 or 4 minute process, and the gentleman said, "Where are you from?" And I said the US, and he said, "What's your name?" And I said, "Melissa," and he said, "You get down to business." Or he said, "You get straight to the point." And I said, "Yes, I do," and paid him and kind of walked away. Because I get straight to the point. But being somewhere where that's not the norm it's really an experience to see there are other ways to be. You don't have to be that directive. You don't have to be that goal oriented.
So I guess this is totally based on stereotype or I've never been to Oklahoma, but I would think that people would be slower there than they are in Washington. They I don't know. Is that wrong? Is it?
Yeah. So I don't think we've said yet, but I'm from Oklahoma. I'm from the middle of the country, which is what some people describe as the South, some people describe as the Midwest. And as fast as I'm talking right now, that is not the Oklahoma part of me. It is. Yeah. I mean, I'm from Oklahoma. I work for farmers, and I found it much easier to relate to that kind of more relational, less get down to the point type of being, because I'm from Oklahoma, because I work for farmers.
So
and there's a lot to be said for, having the conversation about the weather and, finding out whose mother's brother's aunt's cousin is in the hospital. And
right.
I mean, that is much more a part of my, my home family, my home cultures. Being than here in DC. And I moved to DC. You can say, well, 1,000 reasons I moved to DC, but one of them is that my personality is a little more uptight. But yeah, it was an interesting reflection of, like, sometimes I am in DC and I find that side of things, that harshness, to be overwhelming. And I think, you're in a city, act like you're in a city. And, sometimes I find I'm with people that don't respond well. And I think, okay, act like you're in Oklahoma now. Act like you're in Oklahoma now. And I definitely had some of those moments of like, okay, act like you're in Oklahoma. Shake hands and give hugs and, a lot more chit chat.
So, because I know that you were pretty good about posting pictures and things on Facebook while you were gone, and just almost everything that you posted sounded like you were having a really good time, and you even said that you felt homesick for South Africa when you were, I don't know if it was when you were on the plane or when you came back.
Yeah, I mean, I had a very good time, and, again, there's a lot that goes into that, but I think it was such a sustained amount of time. And at this particular point in my life, I mean, I was able to be very calm. And I mean, of course, that's helped by being in a program where, we certainly didn't know what was coming one day to the next necessarily, but, we had things we had to do. These courses are taken in a cohort. And so there were 11 of us there, plus the professors who, we knew to some extent beforehand, and there was a very family type atmosphere in a way, and in some ways, like any other family, and there are all kinds of theories about that we could go into, but dysfunctional and conflict and all of that. But on the other hand, we're all learning about how people are and how people work together better. So we have a lot of tools to work out our conflict and to give each other feedback in a healthy way. And we have the benefit of a year and a half of relationship with one another. So we really could support one another in our homesickness and our journey. So yeah, I mean, I had a very uniquely good time. And I've had a couple people tell me, like, those pictures, you looked like you were just there. Everybody really does. There and really being and really blissed out.
Yeah,
and
you seem totally joyful.
That is a good way of describing it. Yeah.
And do you feel like was that typical of the group, or was it did you feel that you in particular had that reaction? Some people I didn't hear from at all, but the people who did, like, post stuff on Facebook, they seem like they're having an amazing time.
Yeah, I think most people had a very, very good time, and in different ways. And just because you have a very good time doesn't mean parts of it aren't hard. But I think it was all that it was advertised and more. It was one of those things that will probably never happen like that again, but that you'll kind of remember always.
Wow. Have you carried any of that over into your returned existence, like with your workplace or with the other members of the cohort or anything like that?
Well, I'll tell you, I'm trying, but it's hard. I mean, it is like swimming against the tide. I mean, yeah, in my workplace in particular, there's a lot of potential for stress and, like, what's going to happen and how's it going to happen and how do we control it. And I am really fighting that, in the most passive possible way of fighting, just to not buy into it, not get in that spiral, and just be in the moment, and know that you can't really control what's going to happen, and you certainly can't fix what did happen. So just handle it and know that you're competent to handle it. I think that's what I came away with.
So I have one final question that I want to ask you, which is going just back to OD in general. Do you have like a motto or a watchword or a phrase, like something that you hold on to when you're doing this OD work, even though you're still a student? Is there like a thing that you hang on your wall, or,
not exactly. Maybe that's a good idea. But so I am a student of OD, but I've also been definitely using OD in my life and especially in my workplace for the past 6 months or so. It's really called on those skills. And I have, the kind of father of OD, Kurt Lewin, once said, "There's nothing as practical as a good theory." And I really like that because it sums up that OD is both a practice and it's a area of study. I mean, it's research and action research and articles and journals and all that jazz. And I kind of embody both of those things in some ways. I really want to be a practitioner, but I also understand how important theory is to inform that. Otherwise, you're just doing stuff and you're not really sure why or what effect it's having. So that's something I keep in mind a lot. And there's something called the Seashore Choice Awareness Matrix, which basically, it outlines your awareness of behavior, and how the idea behind it is just to make you more aware of your choice, and how if you are not conscious of your behavior and actively making choices about your behavior, you may be working out of an automatic mode or out of socialization. You may be blaming others for what are ultimately your choices. So that's something I think about a lot. And I actually have that one on a Post-it at my desk.
You use that tool to remind yourself, I have a choice in how I'm going to react, and I can think about it and make an informed decision.
Yeah, one of my favorite professors in a conversation outside of a classroom setting, but said, all you really have in life is choices and consequences. Choices and consequences. And that's true. I mean, if you think about it, it's actually very, very profound. There's not much else except choices and consequences.
And on that note, thank you, Melissa Kessler. Melissa George Kessler is a student at American University, and we've been talking about her trip to South Africa as she comes toward the end of her master's program in organization development. Thank you very much, Melissa.